Thank you so much for joining us today. We are recording this session, so we will be able to share this with the whole group after we finish up today. I'd like to just kind of kick us off. I know that time is of the essence, so I will introduce our moderator, Mr. Bryan Ware, who is the CEO of Next5 and also the former director of cybersecurity for CISA. Bryan.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thanks everybody for coming and joining us today. Thanks to NeoSystems for hosting this and pulling everybody together, this media roundtable. We're doing this at a fairly extraordinary time with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, in full swing, and announcements last night from the White House, which I'm sure we'll touch on as we go through today. So we pulled together just a fantastic group of cybersecurity experts to join us today. I'll introduce them really quickly now, and then we'll jump into the panel. We're going to spend, about half of our time today with me asking each of our panelists some questions, and then we're going to have time for you in the media to ask them questions as well. So first of all, we're really pleased to have Kiersten Todt, the Chief of Staff at CISA, with us. We also have Gerstell, Senior Advisor on the International Security Program at CISA and former NSA General Counsel. And then Frank Salufo, a Commissioner on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission and the Director of Auburn University's McCrary Institute. And last but not least, from NeoSystems, we have Ed Bassett, who is the Chief Information Security Officer. They are a managed security provider serving the government contractor market. So you've got all of the bios. I won't go through any more on that. We've got a lot to get through in this hour, so we're going to jump right in. I hope that this is a really insightful and engaging conversation for everyone. It will be for the panelists. We like each other and like listening to what each other have to say. We're going to focus kind of broadly on three topics today. We're going to talk everything really, I think, in the context of what's going on right now, but we'll definitely talk about supply chain, we'll talk about critical infrastructure, and we will talk about the Shields Up initiative that hopefully everybody is seeing plenty of from CISA on social media and elsewhere. That'll take us 35 minutes, and then we'll jump into questions from our journalists. You can submit those questions in the chat, so don't wait. And then you can also do the hand raise thing, and I will call on you and let you ask any of the panelists, really whatever's on your mind. But ask good questions or they won't answer them. So everybody keep their lines muted, I guess, on particularly our journalists until we get to the end. And let's just jump right in. So first of all, I think, Glenn, I'm going to direct this first question at you. Throughout this Russia-Ukraine conflict, there's been a huge feature and focus on cyber means, cybersecurity. Are you seeing what you expected to see? Maybe particularly with regards to the announcement last night from the White House. Did we expect to see more? Have we seen the worst yet? Kind of give us your perspective on that.
Thanks, Bryan, for the question, and thanks to NeoSystems and all my other fellow panelists here. You're asking exactly the right question to start us off. Let me maybe respond with just 3 or 4 quick points. First of all, as you said, after weeks, if not months, of generalized statements about the Russian cyber threat with no specific or credible warning of any particular attack, we had something extraordinary happen within the past 24 hours, as you mentioned, which is that the President of the United States made a specific statement about evolving intelligence that indicates that Russia may be engaged in preparations for a cyber attack. That's really unprecedented for the president to do this. It sounds like there's some specific intelligence behind this. Perhaps we're also just calling out Russian behavior beforehand, as we've done with their false flag operations. So that's point one, which is this is an extraordinary warning. Number two, we know what Russia is capable of. When I was at the National Security Agency, we regarded Russia as a very, very sophisticated cyber adversary. We've seen them in Ukraine in the winters, right in the middle of winter in 2015 and 2016, shutting off electricity, and a year later, unleashing the world's most destructive computer virus, the NotPetya virus, spreading around the world, causing billions of dollars of destruction. Here in the United States, we've seen their spy agencies, Russian spy agencies, engage in the solar wind intrusion. There are ransomware gangs engage in the Colonial Pipelines attack. So we know what they're capable of. And point three, what about their execution? What are they doing now? Well, you're absolutely right, Bryan, that we have not seen since the invasion on February 24th, any really destructive cyber attacks in Ukraine. We've heard all the reasons for it. Perhaps they're not coordinating with their military action. The Ukrainians have a strong defense. Maybe we're offensively preempting them. The Russians didn't think it was necessary. They didn't want to ruin the economy, et cetera. But in the US, so far, we have not seen what we feared, which is a physically destructive cyber attack. I think the main reason for that is, one, it takes time and effort to engage in a really seriously destructive physical cyber attack against operating technology. This isn't just defacing a website or a distributed denial of service attack. This is something far more significant. But also the second reason, and here I'm giving credence to the Kremlin acting rationally, is that logic tells us it's very hard to see a real long-term strategic benefit for the Kremlin to engage in a physically destructive cyber attack in the United States. Obviously, it could cause harm, but unlike, say, disinformation or cyber theft of intellectual property, which have long-term real-world consequences, a physically destructive cyber attack probably produces a little more temporary effects, could still be locally devastating, of course, but it's not going to produce a real strategic upside for Vladimir Putin. And it's going to carry very significant risks of retaliation and escalation in a completely unknown area, in a completely unknown way, which isn't going to be to Putin's advantage. And then finally, that takes me to my last point, which is all of this is based on rational decision-making, which is something I think we can give possibly the benefit of the doubt to the Kremlin so far, even though they may have misjudgments and mistakes. But once the sanctions kick in, these unprecedented, extraordinary sanctions, after the initial devaluation of the ruble, we're now going to see over the next several weeks the real consequences of this, in which Russia is turned back to look like the Khrushchev era Soviet Union, completely isolated, but it won't even have the former Soviet republics to rely on in Eastern Europe. And this occurs at a time of increased global interdependence. The consequence for cyber is that I think Putin could then be in a position where he feels either he has nothing left to lose, nothing more to lose, or alternatively, he may feel for domestic reasons, he has to strike back at what the Russian people feel are unfair and inappropriate sanctions and do something very visible to the United States. That's what I'm concerned about. I hope I'm wrong, but that's the concern.
Oh, I mean, Glenn, thank you for that. That's, I mean, what a great perspective. Frank, anything to add? I mean, are you seeing what you expected to see? Maybe what are you looking for as we look forward?
Well, thank you, Bryan, and thanks to everyone for the opportunity to share a couple thoughts. I think Glenn did a great job framing the dilemma we're in right now, the challenges, and where we may go. I think I might add another factor. I don't think the military warfighting campaign has gone the way Russia thought it would. So we have to realize we have to look through the eyes of the adversary. They've got their hands full, and clearly at a time and a place that may change in terms of the pointing of the cannons closer to the United States. But one thing that is a little bit surprising, and I'm a big Mark Twain fan, and one of my favorite quotes is, whereas history may not repeat itself, it tends to rhyme. And if you look at previous military conflicts that Russia has been involved in, cyber has played a much more prominent role as a precursor to military conflict. So if we look back to, I mean, they were the first state-on-state actor in 2007 in terms of their massive distributed denial of service attacks on Estonia. But 2008, I think, was a real game changer in terms of how they used cyber. And I might include electronic warfare into the cyber bucket, which I think there's more of that activity going on than we're maybe fully aware of or discussing. But in terms of the ramp up in 2008 and the invasion of Georgia, they basically blinded and deafened the Georgians to be able to move the tanks in pretty seamlessly afterwards. In the 2014 invasion of Crimea, the annexation of Crimea and Ukraine, also electronic warfare and kinetic attacks on critical infrastructure played a big role in terms of their military planning efforts. And I don't want to get all wonky here, but I think cyber is going to be a predominant element of all conflicts going forward. And those that can integrate cyber into their warfighting doctrine and campaigns will be leading in the years ahead. So I don't think we should just look at it as the 0 and 1 kind of incidents. Obviously, we need to be prepared for those, as 2015, 2016 indicated, in terms of a cyber event having a kinetic impact or a physical impact. That Rubicon was crossed. But I think we need to think about this issue maybe a little more broadly. Because if you look at electronic warfare, and if you look at Bassett, and if you look at the alerts that have been sent by CISA, FBI, and NSA to our US colleagues, I think there is the need to just expand our thinking a little bit. Let me say the one thing that I'm most surprised about. Ukraine has kicked some serious butt in terms of countering disinformation efforts. And when we talk cyber, we're talking zeros and ones. We're talking what Fort Meade does and Cybercom does and does very well overseas. From a Russian perspective, cyber is still part of a broader information warfare campaign, which is basically perception management, disinformation, and psychological operations. I've got to say, I've been incredibly impressed with how Ukraine has fought that battlefield. They're winning on that battlefield. And I think a lot of that is also thanks to some of the US companies. So long-winded way of saying, and I hate using a sports analogy because this is life and death, but we are still in the early innings here. And when the sanctions do have their real bite, will they start to look like North Korea, which is a state sponsor of cybercrime, as opposed to the opposite, or will they turn to disruptive and destructive attacks? Dare I say, they have the capability. But as we all know, intent, capability have to marry up. And I don't think we've seen, luckily, that marriage just yet. So long-winded way of saying, I was happy to see the call to action, because at the end of the day, agnostic of who the perpetrator is, we all have a responsibility to shore up our defenses and become more resilient. And Kiersten and her colleagues at CISA and Bryan, the work you did while you were there is all to be applauded, because it allows us to have a fighting chance. Because here's the reality. I'm going to be in the minority on this, I'm pretty sure. The initiative still remains with the attacker. Now is the time to get blue and get the defenders at least in a position to have a fighting chance.
Frank, that's a perfect segue to Kiersten. Thank you for that. So let's follow up on that conversation, Kiersten. How do you think about the cyber readiness or preparedness of the United States? And I've certainly been seeing this shields up messages even last night from Director Easterly and others. So help our audience to understand a little bit more about what you're doing, what CISA is doing, and what shields up means.
Thanks very much, Bryan, and thanks so much to my fellow panelists and to NeoSystems. I'll just play off of something that Frank just said. Obviously, where we are today and the effectiveness builds on the shoulders of the work, really, of the panel, as well as many others, Bryan, Glenn, Frank, the work that you've done in this space. Because as we all know, this has been a very evolving issue over the years. We've all worked together in some capacity for quite a long time. And so we have that institutional knowledge about where we've come from and where we need to be. And so I really appreciate the comments from both Glenn and Frank about what comes next. As our nation continues to support Ukraine, we must also continue to shield our critical infrastructure from retaliatory cyber attacks or just initiative cyber attacks. And I think one of the points that was made by Glenn about NotPetya, we have this challenge also that even if we're not the attack, we're not the entity that's being targeted, there are spillover effects. And so when we're looking at resilience, when we're looking at strengthening ourselves, there's so many pieces to this that we have to be paying attention to. As was cited earlier, CISA has been providing additional resources, guidance, support for months since we first started having some level of intelligence so that we could work with the private sector, work with state and local governments, tribal and territorial governments about shoring up resources and defenses. And now what we're doing is reiterating the call for critical infrastructure to adopt a heightened security posture in light of President Biden's statement yesterday that intelligence shows that Russia is exploring options for potential cyber attacks against the US homeland. As the nation's cyber defense agency, CISA, we're standing ready to help organizations prepare for, respond to, mitigate the impact of cyber attacks. And we know how important resilience is. And what's been interesting, as we look at this is it's both about certainly recovery response, but we really want to be able to prevent what we can. And, the good news there is that often it doesn't require a lot of sophistication necessarily. We've got to raise the baseline. And that's why the call to action for encryption, for patching, for multi-factor authentication, these are all still the basics that really need to be executed and instituted across the board. When cyber incidents are reported quickly, also CISA can use the information to render assistance and to prevent other organizations from falling victim to a cyber attack. You've mentioned that we have the Shields Up effort, which we continue to keep current. We're encouraging all organizations to have Shields Up. The webpage is available at CISA.gov. Again, it's constantly being updated with guidance to help organizations adopt a stronger cybersecurity posture. And we have both messages for CEOs or leaders of organizations, as well as for the CISOs. And the messages really are about lowering the threshold for reporting, being able to bring the CISO to the table. I think one of the things that's been really encouraging from our perspective, we've heard from global companies that them being able to point to Shields Up has given them essentially cover to say, hey, we've got to invest in this. We've got to have this heightened security posture. Now, we've heard also from companies, how long are we going to have to keep this heightened security posture? And that's, one of these risk management decisions. But a lot of what Shields Up is talking about is ensuring that you've covered the basics and that your supply chain, and I know we're going to talk about this, is also covering the basics. And so when we look at this, when we look at what we're focusing on, these are the things that industries need to be doing, regardless of whether or not there's a Russia-Ukraine conflict, war, crisis, or if we're in peacetime, because we have got to raise the bar for our cybersecurity across the board. Over the past week, we've updated our technical guidance, specifically the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog with our partners. We've released cybersecurity products on Conti ransomware, on Russian state-sponsored cyber actors gaining network access by exploiting default MFA and other efforts. And I think, in looking at all of this, most importantly, we've been working closely with critical infrastructure partners over the past several months to ensure awareness of potential threats. The current threat environment really requires all of us to be laser focused on resilience, to doing what we can to prevent an attack, but also ensuring that if one does occur, that we are prepared and we're minimizing the disruption. And this is where, again, the supply chain conversation is so critical. We have to focus on ensuring preparedness and a rapid and coordinated response to mitigate the impact of disruptions on our critical infrastructure. And, as we look at all of these efforts, again, and looking at how we've supported, CISA has also established a catalog of free services from our government partners, the open source community, and the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative to assist with the critical need of the spot that we're in. As we've said, even in peacetime, when we're looking at these issues, this is not a one entity response. The interdependencies of our digital economy, the interdependencies of our critical infrastructure mean that a whole of government, a whole of nation, and quite frankly, a whole of world approach is how we're going to stay strong and resilient. CISA plays a piece in this, but part of our role is also ensuring that we're communicating and we're getting out there with the information so that we can inform the partners that have the operational authority in many cases, and that we can work more collaboratively with our partners, but being seen as a trusted resource to be able to provide guidance and information. And as we look at this conflict, I support the words of both Frank and Glenn as far as how we look at this. There are so many pieces to this. Are we dealing with a rational actor? At what point is the tipping point for what comes next? The truth of the matter is we don't have a lot of the answers to these questions. So we're managing risk. And as CISA's role as the nation's cyber defense agency, our role in helping to manage that risk is to ensure that our partners have the resources and the information that they need to best defend themselves.
Oh, Kiersten, that's great. And I love what you were saying there about resilience. I mean, we're in this time of crisis right now, but every day on the internet is a day that has risk. And so this call to action is certainly very, very timely in this moment, but really there will be other moments next month, next quarter, whenever that comes. And I want to double click on a little bit of what Kiersten just kind of talked us through, and certainly on the Shields Up page, the guidance for multi-factor authentication, network segmentation, and so forth. But we also know, kind of going back to some of Glenn and Frank's comments, that the Russians have used supply chain attacks. We know that many organizations have very complex supply chains. So, what are some things that companies should be doing to manage that third-party risks, and how should they be thinking about supply chain risks?
I mean, thanks, Brian, and thanks everyone else for joining us today. I mean, certainly managing this risk is really difficult, even for those organizations that have, a lot of resources available to do it, and many of them don't, right? The supply chain is made up primarily of small and mid-sized companies. That's the vast majority, 70-some%, I think, is in the defense supply chain, for example. So, why is this relevant today? Our adversaries have figured out that a successful attack, for example, on a service provider or a software vendor, can open up access to a whole bunch of targets. And our adversaries have also figured out that, further down in the supply chain, those are often easier targets than the well-defended giants that are sitting at the top. So, all the threats that we heard from the other panelists, I think if you think about where are those most likely to be directed, it's most likely that they're going to be somewhere in the middle or the lower part of the supply chain. In terms of what to do about it, I think, what companies are not today thinking enough about their IT operations, whether it be managed service providers or an IT operations team. So in order for the IT that they buy to be safe, it's really necessary to configure it and operate it in a hardened way, in a secure way, and maintain that operationally. And we've seen, numerous examples of exploitation of misconfigured cloud services by threat actors, for example. So these are, high-profile commodity cloud services being exploited, and you say, is the cloud provider doing something wrong? Not really. It's not their fault, right? It's the operational services that were wrapped around that cloud, again, by an MSP or an IT team. And companies are always asking about the security of the cloud. It's a big concern. And every cloud provider has a suite of certifications and a really well-oiled presentation that they present with all their security and compliance credentials, so that the cloud providers in general take this very seriously and do a good job, because it's a barrier to making a sale. But it's still possible to configure and operate those otherwise safe services in wildly unsafe ways. And companies are really not yet focusing enough attention on the operational aspect. In this case, managed service providers, IT ops teams. Operationally, hardening, patching, really challenging. It's common, for a security questionnaire to ask about penetration testing or vulnerability scanning, and asking your suppliers, are you doing these things? But the critical metric is time to patch. How quickly and how reliably are those suppliers able to close up vulnerabilities and prevent exploitation? I can't stress enough the patching aspect of it is critical, no matter how inconvenient it might be. And so then if you're looking at how to manage the risk you're inheriting from your suppliers, I think first start by understanding risk in terms of information flow and dependence, and focus on those suppliers where the risk comes back to you, where you rely on the supplier and would be directly impacted if they didn't protect your data and their systems. Are you sharing sensitive data with them? Are you relying on them to protect it? Do you rely on their services to protect your own systems, such as an IT or security service provider? in my mind, those should be at the top of the list. And I think, as we look at how to get our head around this, Kiersten talked about Shields Up. That's certainly very helpful. It gets it front of mind, so the conversation's out there. But I think we're moving past the days where it's okay to say, well, I have a contract, and that contract has some mutual non-disclosure language that says they'll protect the data I give them at least as much as I protect, or they protect their own data. That sort of standard language, that's just not enough. I think we're entering an era where it's really necessary in all those cases to flow down to the supply chain a reasonable set of security expectations and ask to see evidence that those expectations are being met. So that could be a third-party audit like SOC 2 or CMMC when that gets here in terms of being commercially available. It could be answering a questionnaire. It's very, very common technique. But in general, we need to have an era of transparency about security practices and an agreement to share information. Kiersten talked about incident reporting. I think getting that transparency throughout the supply chain and in and out of government is going to be really critical to maintain the resilience that Kiersten talked about.
Ed, thank you. I do want to recognize Joseph, Tim. I see your questions in the chat. We're going to get there in just a minute. We are right on time. I think what I'll do with our panelists, and Glenn, I'm going to start with you. Let's just, we've covered a lot of ground. Just maybe take a minute. Is there anything else just based on anything else that you've heard that you'd want to elaborate on? If there's nothing, then that's fine. But I want to give each of our panelists kind of a last word. So we'll start with you, Glenn.
Thanks. I think the panel's done a superb job of laying out all the sort of key points for us to consider. One thing that we probably aren't going to have time to get into, but I'll just sort of leave it as a marker for a future conversation, is exactly what we might do in response if it should turn out that the Kremlin perhaps, as I said, irrationally or emotionally decides to react to domestic crises internally in Russia and lash out at us in a destructive way. So what would the U.S. response be under circumstances where we have already imposed very significant sanctions? We don't have a lot more maneuvering room here, short of some kind of further physical attack on Russia, which we may not, because of our values, want to impose on them what they might well be willing to impose on us. And so I think there's a lot more that our society is going to have to think about in the future. That's a question for another day, but it's a sort of fascinating question, as Frank was alluding to, the cyber wars of the future, a very scary harbinger of what things might be in the future. Let's hope we don't get there.
Yeah. And maybe some of our reporters are going to try to follow some of that line of thinking with you. Frank, any last thoughts from you?
Yeah, just very briefly to try to tie some of the cyber discussion in Ukraine with supply chain issues. I mean, firstly, positive development to see how, and I'm going to completely generalize here and not get into specificity, but how Ukraine was able to link up to the European grid, I think was a massively significant development. Moldova as well, for that matter, and not dependent upon their old Soviet technology, which obviously gives the Russians a huge leg up in terms of intelligence preparation of the battlefield. Two, in terms of supply chain, Russia is an issue. I think some of the binding operational directives that CISA has engaged in the past vis-a-vis Kaspersky are bearing fruit now. Had we not done that a few years ago, I think we'd be in a very different position today if we had to do it on the fly. But the real supply chain issue is China. And I don't mean to go on a rant here, but we don't have visibility of our supply chains. There's some great initiatives. There are gazillion executive orders, directives, but it's still admiring the problem. Here's the reality. I don't think anyone can tell you with any veracity that they can have their arms fully around the supply chain. And I'll just make one note here, and I see Tim Starks is on the call, and thank you for running a piece I did on this in terms of chips. And so when you're looking at IT and OT convergence here, which is really what the supply chain question demands, you've got to also look at it at the hardware, firmware, software level. I think a lot of the emphasis has been on software, some on hardware. Firmware, we got a long way to go because I'm not even sure we can get our arms around that. But long-winded way of saying we could look a whole lot like Ukraine if we don't get our arms around some of the chips and underlying infrastructure questions. So I don't mean to sound alarmist, but at the end of the day, this is more of a China issue than I think a Russia issue, and will be with us for quite some time.
I agree with you. I heard some government leaders, Frank, refer to Russia as a tornado, and as China is to climate change, and I think I completely agree with you. But the tornado we face today is still a significant issue. Kiersten, any parting thoughts from you? And by the way, they're not parting thoughts because the questions are coming in and they're all coming your way, as I suspected they might. But before we get to those, anything just to tie up the rest of the panelists?
Yeah, I'll take a different tact on the supply chain discussion because I don't know that it'll be raised by the journalists. But given the fact that the journalists are really speaking to all citizens and speaking to broader audiences, the main point right now in this moment, because I know there's questions about what level of intelligence. The main issue here is that we all have a role and a responsibility in addressing the cyber risk facing our country. As I shared earlier, we've all on the panel have been working in this space for a long time, and there was a period of time when it was an IT department. We are now in the place where every individual has a responsibility and an accountability to cybersecurity. And so as we look at large organizations, small organizations, state and local governments, territorial, tribal governments, everybody has a role here. And that's why Shields Up and these efforts are really intended to make sure that everyone is paying attention. And if you're already working with CISA through one of our collaboration programs, lean in. If you're not working with us, send me a note, I'll get you connected. But the risks that we're facing are too severe, too complex, as I mentioned earlier, for any organization to manage alone. And where this comes into play for businesses and really looking at any entity, any organization, is that every individual has an opportunity to be a force multiplier for security. When we look at threats, when we look at vulnerabilities, we often see humans as the weakest link. I would encourage companies, encourage leaders, business leaders to look at your employees as the opportunity to be a force multiplier. Ensure that you are raising the baseline for security. I talked about patches and encryption and multi-factor authentication. If you think that those are too simple, which I don't think anybody does at this point, we just look back a year to Colonial Pipeline and recognizing that that wasn't even a company that was likely targeted because they transported 45% to the East Coast of fuel, but because they were an easy target. We have to make it difficult for our adversaries to attack us. And this should hold true regardless of what political, geopolitical conflict, crisis, war is happening. And so I just, in this moment, as we're thinking through all of this, the reason why we're spending so much time talking about Shields Up, talking about these efforts, is because we know that we still have to raise this baseline. And that's a responsibility that each of us has. And so these simple security controls that we continue to talk about, whether it's MFA or others, are so important to creating the resilience, to preventing what we can prevent, and making us resilient to what does happen. And so it's up to each of us to develop a culture of security, really not just for companies, but truly for the nation, as we look to help be more resilient. And cybersecurity, we all know this, but I will stress this, is no longer just an IT issue. It's an enterprise management challenge. Before I came to this job, I was working as a follow-up to the Commission on Cybersecurity during the Obama administration to help small businesses be more cyber secure. To the point about the supply chain, we are all part of this supply chain now. And so the role that we can play in helping to be more resilient and protect ourselves is to pay attention to the fact that we actually each have a role in the resilience, not just of our companies, our communities, but truly of the nation.
Awesome. Totally agree. Ed, quick thoughts, last thoughts so that we can get to these questions that just keep coming in.
Sure. I want to double down on Kiersten's work together message in terms of information sharing and really getting the information flow between companies and between companies and the government. We saw with SolarWinds huge benefits because FireEye detected the attack and was very open and willing and able to share, right? So they're the exception rather than the rule. They have an unusual amount of expertise and an unusual openness with, their competitors, with the, other members of industry and the government. But we saw a huge benefit in terms of our ability as a nation to respond to that attack because of their actions. And I think that's, again, it's an exception rather than the rule. I think it's really critical that we encourage, we incentivize private sector to think differently about information sharing. We focus right now on reporting the aftermath of successful attacks. I really think we need to shift that to the left and engage in information sharing about precursors, attempted attacks, all those things. We've got some very low bandwidth mechanisms available today, email and things like that. But I think that's great for after the fact incident reporting. If we're talking about defensive cyber operations and working together the way Kiersten is mentioning, we need to rethink the mechanisms that we use and really get that into the operational mode.
Thank you. Here to that. So without further ado, we're going to jump into these questions. These are largely directed towards Kiersten, but I think that there may be some others that can amplify here. So Joseph and Tim, both of you asking something that my Twitter feed last night would have predicted. So I'll just quickly state, there was the announcements from the White House yesterday. Can or should the government share more about the intelligence behind these new threats and what constraints is the government facing? I think Tim also trying to get to like what was maybe the thought process there. Definitely some frustrations from some of the InfoSec community. So Kiersten, I'll let you take that on first, at least.
Thanks, Bryan. And I think there's always going to be frustration until people feel like they see everything. But I think what's hard is to understand is that I think what's important to understand is this administration has been incredibly forward-leaning on the amount of information that it's sharing. And in fact, what it's talking about is the evolving intelligence, right? And so this to me is extremely forward-leaning on the fact that Russia is exploring options for potential cyber attacks. And I'm not, when people are looking for additional intelligence, the important piece here is what the message is. And the message really is about ensuring that every critical infrastructure owner and operator, every company is paying attention. I think, sometimes you run the risk, and this is not at all I'm not in the president's head. I think that, this is a very forward-leaning message, but you want to make sure that everybody, because if we don't have all of the information, that everybody is paying attention to the fact that this is a conflict, that we're seeing intelligence, that Russia's exploring options, and that we've got to do our part in order to, again, create this resilience and harden our systems.
Yeah, I really want to applaud the administration really throughout this conflict for leaning forward on sharing intelligence. It's not an easy thing to do. I think it has made a difference, certainly with our diplomatic efforts and bringing our allies along. Unclear how much of a deterrent effect it's had on the Russians. But yeah, it's hard to get it right. Okay, so
Bryan, can I add one?
Glenn. Sure.
I just had one thought to underscore what Kiersten just said, and I completely agree with you that the Biden administration has been really strong and I believe very effective in this area quite recently. But just drawing on my own experience, I know how we used to debate the questions about, can we release a particular piece of classified information, whether it had something to do with cyber or something else that was going to be important for either our allies to know or some element of the American economy to know, and had to weigh that against the risk of to sources and methods, and possibly including actually endangering double agents, et cetera. So we're all aware of the sort of risk reward ratio that goes into that. But having said that, I think the level of announcements that we've seen thus far are significant. There's certainly enough to get people to pay attention to this. And then finally, my last quick point is, the FBI does have relationships, cleared relationships, secure relationships with big defense contractors, some of the financial sector, the energy sector, and the ability to pass classified details on to them if necessary. So the simple point is, just because there's a quote, merely a White House press release isn't the full story. The American government has some very strong capabilities in this area.
Hey, Bryan, can I piggyback on a couple points here? Because firstly, who is the target audience? The target audience, I don't think, was the InfoSec community for this. There the JCDC, there's so many other collaborative environments where hopefully we're translating the nouns into verbs and we're operationalizing some of these concepts. But as we all touched on, small, medium-sized businesses are the backbone of our country. And how do we pull them into this discussion? And I think, I mean, the Intel business, Glenn knows very well. At best, you're estimators, you're not clairvoyant. If you have the answer, you don't have a communications issue, you're going to prevent it and preempt it. And rarely do you get the when, where, how to be able to move in and operationalize that. But I just want to be able to underscore that the target audience may not have been our community. The target audience, because I mean, hopefully our community is well aware in terms of some of the blocking and tackling every company needs to do. But here's the stark reality. The vast majority of incidents still occur because of phishing, because of the lack of MFA or even 2FA. And I have a feeling we're going to be talking about this 20 years from now. So the reality is I'm happy to see them lean forward. I do think on the Intel side, the biggest success story, and we were talking about this before people got on, is literally the marrying up of Rob Joyce's group and the Cybersecurity Directorate at NSA with CISA and FBI. Once you hit that triad, you can move mountains, and we're starting to see some of that. So just wanted to jump in. Remember who the audience is. It may not have been our community.
Yeah. Thanks all of you for that color. Kiersten, I'm going to come back to you. I'm skipping around these questions just a little bit. There's a great question here near and dear to my heart about something you mentioned, the known exploited vulnerability catalog. It was frustrating during my time to have to do bod after bod for vulnerability after vulnerability. So you guys just fixed it and said, fix all these vulnerabilities with one bod. But the question here I'm interested to know as well, are agencies meeting those deadlines? You know, how are they doing, given how important that is to improving that US government resilience?
And it's a great question, because I think specifically, you know, coming out of having not been in government and coming in and knowing, to your point, Bryan, where the challenges have been, to look at that catalog and to see the government, to see CISA be so prescriptive as we were looking at this, to say, we're going to tell you all of these, what we can see right now, and that catalog continues to be added to. And what's also important is how much it's been accessed by non-government agencies. So we're seeing the private sector access it to look at that. And, you know, I don't have the specific statistics right now. I can certainly follow up with that. But the agencies are working on this. The agencies are absolutely taking this, and they're working together, and they're asking for help where needed, and they're following up on this. I mean, this is such a critical source of information that it, you know, when we look at cybersecurity, what we try to be is as prescriptive as possible. So to say here the known exploited vulnerabilities, what's also important is that we released a known exploited vulnerabilities of what we've seen Russia exploit, and we're updating that as well. So it's about information, because as we know in this space, there's so much data, there's so much out there, that if we can help curate that, certainly for the purposes of this conflict, this crisis, this war, then we are helping out and we're moving forward. And I think, you know, I am so proud of this particular part of this, knowing where agencies have struggled, and important again that this has become a tool not just for government but also for the private sector. And I want to follow up on something that Glenn said, you know, with the FBI and the private sector. Coming into this role, I had laid out for myself some of the things that I really thought were important to achieve. And having been in this space with each of you for so long, you know, the public-private partnership phrase, what that meant. And when I hadn't started yet, but when Jen had done her Black Hat speech and talked about the hackneyed term, I remember being like, yes, this resonates so loudly, because we're so far beyond that phrase and what it means. And so the operational collaboration between industry and government really has just excelled since August, since the JCDC was launched. And to the point that Glenn made about the sharing of information, there is so much sharing of information right now with the JCDC, with government. And oftentimes it's not even about solutions or specific intelligence, but it's about assessments of what are you seeing, how, and it's that ability to have that conversation so that we can put pieces together with imperfect information. And I think that has become so critical. You're taking the government's knowledge of adversary actors, nation state activity, all of these pieces, with industry going so deep. I think Ed had mentioned before the work, of the private sector community with solar winds and what they were able to see. When you marry all that together, Frank talked about the triad of government marriage, and then you take industry marriage and all of this, we're better, and the force multiplier is so much more significant than we've ever seen. And I was so hoping that we could get to this place, and to see what we're already producing, I think is impressive. We obviously have a long way to go. We're certainly not at the destination, but that operational collaboration, that sharing of information and intelligence that is now being collected by all, and the recognition, not just by government, but by industry, that we have to work together, is certainly progress.
Thank you for that. And I think, if you didn't catch something that Kiersten said there, please hear her say that not only are we saying shields up, and not only is the White House saying there's specific intelligence, but also those vulnerabilities that we just went through that question on, those are being updated with the vulnerabilities that we know and believe and expect that the Russians would be exploiting. So these pieces all fit together. We can't always connect every single one of the dots as explicitly as you might like for simplicity, but I really do believe that CISA and their partners are doing a great job of getting that information out there. So I'm going to turn, we've got a hand up from Derek from SC Media. I guess you're going to come off mic and ask a question for the group.
Yep, thanks. And sorry, this question is also going to be for Kiersten. So regarding sort of the new cyber incident reporting legislation, obviously that just passed, but it's going to have to presumably go through a rulemaking process. So first, sort of with the immediate concerns that you're dealing with right now regarding fallout from the Russia-Ukraine war, is that something that you can even expect to start using in the coming months, or even this year, or when do you anticipate this stuff going live and getting those reports and starting to push out from a policy perspective? And then I know CISA has asked companies through Shields Up to sort of lower their reporting thresholds and report things even if they're not sure that they're significant or a confirmed breach. Are companies actually taking you up on that offer, and are you seeing sort of more proactive reporting in light of some of the warnings that you've been pushing out?
Well, I think, the good news in the incident reporting is that we were certainly hearing before the passage from industry their support of the reporting, because again, it's this recognition that we will all be better if we can share that information. And so we were hearing from companies across the board because of what that would do for their ability to be resilient. Somebody said something to me a couple months ago in one of our efforts that said, people don't trust institutions, they trust individuals. And so what CISA has really been working on is, how do you build that trust with industry through the JCDC, through these very specific relationships and engagements to create that trust for incident reporting. We have a reporting email, report@cisa.gov, that was recently launched in response to incident reporting. We're encouraging every business to do that. We have an individual and a whole watch and call center, as we've always had, that's monitoring that reporting. So we're not obviously going to wait for the rulemaking to not move forward. And we're obviously working in close partnership with FBI and others. So there is a process involved, but that's, rulemaking gets a little bit of inside the Beltway jargon. The point is that we're ready. We're working with the FBI and our partners to move this forward. This is such a critical tool, the ability to report incidents in a timely way so that CISA can then take that information and share it across sectors. I think one of the things, that we haven't talked as much about with supply chain and critical infrastructure, that, our system, when you think about the information sharing and analysis centers that launched in 1998, we have a very sector specific approach to securing our critical infrastructure. But the interdependencies, again, of the digital economy, the interdependencies that have been created through the Internet of Things and others, means that we are, the sectors are connected. And so one sector may know its threats very well, but the ability to create that cross-sector engagement, and that's one of the priorities of the National Risk Management Center within CISA, is critical. And that's where incident reporting can really play a critical role.
Well, we've got one last question, and I think that's how many we have time for. And this one's on port security, which I'll just note as a way to alibi Kiersten a little bit. We have a very close partnership with our sector risk management agency and the Coast Guard, very focused on port security. But I think it is an interesting question. Like, there's so much stress right now on supply chains. Obviously, with the port dynamic being a big part of that. Are you able to comment on what you've seen change in the port security, cybersecurity environment since NotPetya? Are we similar to maybe to some of the previous questions? Are we more secure? Or have we made progress there? Do you still have concerns there?
Well, I think when you look at any sector, and I'll be very curious to get Glenn and Frank's and Ed's perspective on this as well, given the supply chain piece to this. But obviously, when we look at any sector, we're investing in making it more secure. The director is actually speaking at a port security event this morning. It's clearly a priority. And again, it goes to the interdependencies. And one of the advantages that we have at CISA is that the Coast Guard is certainly part of DHS, and so the ability to collaborate and work together is there. I think across the board, we're always looking at improving our resilience and being able to see the interconnectedness and the impact. But I don't know if there's a specific question to the port challenges, but I would just say that CISA certainly prioritized port security. It certainly plays a role in supply chain in a much more visceral way because it's actually the physical part of the supply chain. But as far as the prioritization, it's right up there with the challenges that we have in securing supply chains, as was mentioned earlier by Frank. Ooh, Bryan, I think you're on mute.
I was hoping that we could go a whole hour without anyone having to say that, but I blew it. Glenn, any further on Kiersten's points there?
Not really, just to add a footnote. And by the way, I'm sure you put the mute point in there just so you were able to say that and add a little humor to what is otherwise a very, very serious, sobering conversation here. But just the obvious footnote, which is that as we see in some of these sectors, such as the maritime industry, port security, energy, finance, others, the sectors that are already working together because they need to, because their business requires interconnection and connectivity, produces tremendous advantages and benefits from the efficiencies that we get from that. It also creates vulnerabilities, but those sectors tend to be the ones that are a little better prepared in the cyber world, precisely because they have a basis for working together. And it's the industries, and I know CISA has been particularly focused on this, and Frank made a good comment about small businesses. The vulnerability in our economy extends to these other sectors where there really isn't that level of coordination, and we're only as strong, so to speak, to use the hackneyed term, as the weakest link. So we have a lot of work to be done. But just to close on I think at the right point, I think the administration is off to a very, very strong start in this area.
Hey, Bryan, just a couple of very quick points on this. I mean, you don't need to look too far back to realize just how difficult and complex getting goods from A to B to ultimately on the shelves can actually be. So if we look at, I mean, the potential to make a bad situation worse is real, and it's significant, and I think we're finding that just-in-time process has some challenges agnostic to any bad actor jumping into the fray. But it is worth noting, if you look back to NotPetya, the entities that were impacted greatly, it was FedEx, it was Maersk, it was Merck, it was all that supply chain was snarled. So and some of their systems are a little antiquated. So when you really look at that issue holistically, and you have a perpetrator that's really looking to maximize economic impact, I think that is a sector that we, not to use a bad pun, but we need to make sure that all boats rise here. So and I think that they probably have a ways to go compared to, say, electricity or financial services or defense industrial base.
Bryan, maybe I'll generalize that a little bit. I think, as I look at companies that are where IT is outside the core of their business, right? They think of it as kind of a low cost utility. So, transportation, right? And NotPetya, we saw that as Frank just mentioned, but also manufacturing, construction, those companies that think that don't think of IT as being at the center of their business. It's sort of a low cost utility. And as they start to, as it fails, they realize how deep that dependency is. Maybe they didn't see it that way, but those are the companies that seem to be a little bit behind the curve, if you will.
Oh, thank you to all of you. It's so great to work with professional panelists, because we get to go all the way up to the last scheduled minute. I know that many of you probably have something that is going to start right at 12. So I'm going to get us out of here with a second to spare. Thank you, Neo, for putting this together. Thank you, everyone, all the panelists, for your great insights and your candor. And thank you to our journalists for getting the word out there. That's so important for us to inform the American people more broadly. If you have any follow-up questions, reach out to Janet or Dustin, and they will do their best to get you answers. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, y'all. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.